Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're probably just gonna kind of ease into it as a few people are still kind of jumping on. But we have some music to go. So Steph, if you wouldn't mind kind of talking a little bit about the chat just while I'm pulling things up, that'd be great.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Stephanie Kelly. I'm going to be coordinating the chat tonight alongside Ruth Pickering. We are basically going, as you see, we've welcomed you now, and you're more than interested if you share your name if you're comfortable and any organization you might be involved with. We are also going to have a Q&A at the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, please feel free to text either myself or Ruth or anybody in general in the chat, and we will contact you or check in with you and see if you'd like that question to be addressed to the panelists. If you don't know how to private message, now I'm going to tell you, but now I'm not 100% sure. Oh, yes, I do know. Okay, go to the bottom of the chat right above where you start typing, and it says to, a little drop down menu there, and you can either click on myself or Ruth's names to direct us, message us directly, and that way you don't have to tell everybody what your thoughts are if you're not comfortable with that. We will ask you, as I said, if you're interested in talking to the panelist yourself or asking your questions to the panelist yourself, and if you're not, then that's okay. We can ask the question for you on your behalf. I believe I've covered everything that I need to. But if anyone has any questions, again, feel free to ask in the chat, or later, very soon, we're going to show you an email address you can send questions to if you're having tech difficulties, and I can help you from there as well.
Thanks for that,
Go,
Steph.
Alex. Beautiful.
Yeah, that's great. I'm just noticing that our participants number does kind of keep fluctuating. So we do have a little bit of music just to start us off, and then we'll get going. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're so excited. This is our third in our Conservation Matters webinar series. So we are Hamilton 350 putting this on, and we have some folks from Action 13 helping us out as well. And yeah, we're excited to be talking about water today. Myself and Dawn will kind of be co-hosting the program for you. And then we're really excited to hear from Scott Peck and Arlene Slocum from the Hamilton Conservation Authority and Wellington Water Watchers, respectively. So as Steph kind of said before, you've been muted. So please use the chat box if you have any questions, comments, or introductions. It's located at the bottom of the screen, and Steph kind of provided some info earlier as well. And I think the most important thing is if you do have any questions for the panel, require any assistance or support, you can private message Steph Kelly or Stephanie Kelly or Ruth Pickering, and then Steph's email is also there. So I'll just let folks, if they want to jot that down for a second or make sure they're familiar with the chat, Yeah. So yeah, with that going on. So tonight, Dawn, why don't you give yourself a little bit of an introduction?
Well, I'm co-hosting with you, Alex, and pleased to be able to do this again for the third month in a row. I think this is attracting some attention and hopefully being useful to the people who are participating. My background is I'm involved with Hamilton 350 since its beginning in 2009. I also have I'm involved with the Citizens at City Hall, co-founder of Environment Hamilton, few things along the way, but particularly focused on the climate crisis, and water is at the center of that. The way in which the climate crisis is most dramatically presenting itself is through some forms of water, whether ice melting or flooding taking place or droughts occurring along with fires. These are the ways in which the climate crisis is presenting itself, and water shortages are a major part of that.
Thank you for that, Dawn. And yeah, thank you for helping really ground why, Hamilton 350, a climate justice group, is talking about water tonight. And some of the things that we're going to be talking about, we're going to be looking at our relationship with water. We're going to be talking to Arlene Slocum from the Wellington Water Watchers about, is water really for sale in Ontario, and some of the changes going on that are commodifying water with respect to Nestle, as well as some other issues at the provincial level that really kind of demonstrate a real commodification of this human right and this kind of common good. We're also going to be connecting with Hamilton's Water and talking a little bit about the 24 billion liters of sewage that leaked into our kind of Coots Paradise and Hamilton Harbor. As well, we're really excited and really grateful to be joined by Scott Peck from the Hamilton Conservation Authority. Since the Ford government announced its controversial changes a couple months ago regarding conservation authorities and really just the extreme gutting of them, I think a lot of people have been focused on conservation authorities. That's when our webinar series started. And Scott, we're just so grateful to have you. I think people are really looking to conservation authorities now with more attention because they now know that they're at risk, and people are looking to get engaged and looking to learn more. So we're really excited to have you. And our water panel tonight will feature Arlene, Scott, and all of you. All of you will have a chance to ask some questions and answers as well. And yeah, we're just so excited to be doing this and to have continued doing this for 3 months now. And we're looking to join you even more in the future. So.
Apologies, folks. Due to copyright restrictions, we weren't allowed to show this TED Talk in our video. So if you're interested, please copy down the URL that's in this slide and have a look at Dr. Kelsey Leonard's TED Talk at another time, perhaps shortly after watching our video. Thank you very much, and sorry for the inconvenience. You can pause and copy this down if you'd like, but you should pause now if you would, please. Thank you.
So thank you, everyone. That was just a clip of the whole video, and recommend that and read more. But I think one of the things that we really wanted to start with, I'm sure there's lots of kind of reflections, but one of them was just how we think about this idea of just having a relationship with water. I think so often, particularly for us as settlers, and I think a lot of the folks joining this call, we turn on the tap and clean drinking water is there, but that's not even true a couple kilometers from here, where in Six Nations, there's not always regular access to clean drinking water in many of the homes there because our governments have not ensured that it's provided. So what we, I think have not been taught to think of as necessarily a relationship is something that, when we take a different perspective, when we look at it a different way, there's so much more to kind of learn. And I think that's what we're going to be talking a lot about throughout tonight, is the various perspectives we can take when kind of thinking about water, and what those perspectives lead us to. So yeah, one of the next things we kind of want to draw your attention to is this current exhibit in the Art Gallery of Ontario, by Ruth Cuthand, Don't Breathe, Don't Drink. And I think it again kind of speaks to this cultural and traditional knowledge, understanding that Indigenous communities have and have had for so many kind of generations. And now in this artwork, the artist Ruth Cuthands talking about the water crisis in Indigenous communities here in Canada, and especially in parts of Ontario. And there's intricate beadwork being done to, in the glasses on top, represent the bacteria in water, the black mold in housing, the tarps that many people have found themselves living in. And it's, I think, again, speaks that there's other perspectives than just our own when it comes to water. There's other understandings and relationships with water than just when we turn on the tap. And keeping those perspectives at the forefront is something we hope to kind of dive deeper into as we keep going throughout tonight. So with us tonight is Arlene Slocum, the Executive Director of Wellington Water Watchers. And I'm just going to, just so everyone knows, you can go into your settings at the top and kind of change. So Arlene, I'm hoping you'll be able to unmute yourself and start talking as well now. Yeah. And people can either set their own preferences, whether you want to see me and Arlene's faces or just the screen. That's a setting on your own kind of Zoom. But one of the things we wanted to talk to you about was the Wellington Water Watchers and the work that you've been doing to say no to Nestle. So Arlene, are you able to introduce yourself a little bit and maybe let us know, why do folks in Wellington and even out here in Hamilton want to say no to Nestle?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here tonight. Again, my name is Arlene Slocum. Yeah, my role is as Executive Director of Wellington Water Watchers, but quite honestly, I'm just a person who takes care of whatever tasks we need to get done as an organization. There were a number of us sitting around a kitchen table back in 2007 who recognized some threats to our local waters, the waters that nourish and sustain us here in this area. And at the time, there were a number of them, and this was one of them. None of us had at that point in time recognized that we had a multinational corporate predator in our midst until we recognized that the actual headquarters of Nestle Waters Canada was just recently relocated into Aberfoyle, which is just a little bit south of the city of Guelph, which is, my general hometown area. So there's all sorts of reasons for us why Nestle, and in particular, like corporate water bottling, is, as we would call, the poster child for all the things we might do wrong with water. There's many reasons why. The first is that there's this notion of this multinational corporation that there's this ability to somehow like own and claim water and sell it for profit, which I think like just at the outset is rather offensive to most people. The notion of like commodifying and owning something that is actually the source of life for the sole purpose of profit. That's one major reason. One next major reason is that it is put into pieces of plastic single-use garbage that plague the earth for generations and generations to come. And as we all know, that's a problem we're not escaping in any time in the near future, and that we really have a need to cut it off at the source, the production of plastics. And on top of that, then you have this notion that this water that's being extracted from a region that has its own water needs, whether you're looking at like the ecosystem needs of the water or the community needs of the water, that this water is being, for the most part, like, commodified, bottled, and shipped out of the watershed, never to return. It messes with the hydrologic systems that are in place and have been in place forever to remain in perpetuity. And then on top of that, which I think from my point of view is the most egregious of all, just a little less than an hour south of this national headquarters of this multinational corporation is the community of both Six Nations and Mississauga of the Credit, where access to reliable drinking, clean, safe drinking water is not at everybody's disposal. And here on treaty lands is this multinational corporation extracting water for profit. And you know, just like I say, and not even an hour south of there are people who are dependent on a product that is because there's been a lack of availability of clean drinking water. So we've been on, there's so many reasons why this is so egregious on so many fronts. And we have been opposing this, you know, this extraction for many, many years now. And in more recent years, we've been supporting the claims of folks at Six Nations that this water actually belongs to the people, the treaty peoples here, who have, who have treaty rights and access to these lands and waters. And, you know, their claim in 2019, we supported a rally, which you can see on the screen here, where some youth and elders at Six delivered. So this was from the traditional hereditary council at Six, not the band council, although the band council is none too fond of Nestle themselves either, but the hereditary council, through the youth and the grandmothers and the elders, delivered a cease and desist order to Nestle, and that's what is happening here in this rally. And of course, you know, that was in 2019. Not too much has happened since. In just recently, just this past month, Nestle, because we've called this campaign now our Troubled Waters. There's right on cue there, Alex. So all across North America, where I'd have to say, those of us who have the privilege and the time at our disposal to take our energies and resources to oppose such corporations that might be in our midst, we've made a lot of noise, and we've made it really difficult for this corporate giant. And so all across North America, Nestle decided they needed to sell off their assets, and have done so successfully now to a company called One Rock. And the new branding of this image is now called Blue Triton, which is going to be a lot of fun to play with, and memes and silliness. Like, you know, you can imagine that character of Triton. And at any rate, they're not getting rid of the trouble around their assets. And so our intention is to maintain high pressure on this issue, maintain high pressure on our government at the time, at this moment, or at any time, to not simply transfer permits to a corporation that at this point doesn't have any water bottling in their holdings. Water bottling is a new area, and they're primarily a private equity company. And you couple this on top of the fact that we now all probably know that water is trading on the global market. It's now trading for stocks on Walmart. that was a slip of the tongue, on Wall Street. And that, you know, when you're trading stocks in water and you have private equity firms holding access to permits to water, we're in a situation that is, you know, a little bit frightening to examine. So from my point of view, this is something that we all really need to be keeping our eyes on, and need to be putting an awful lot of pressure on, to make sure that these are just not simply transferred to this private equity firm, and that we actually do some proactive reconciliation work in returning these lands and waters to the peoples on whose land we are all guests.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Arlene. And I guess one of the reoccurring themes that we've talked about on this webcast so far is this theme of like, when we fight, we win. And Wellington Water Watchers has been, I think, of all the organizations we've spoken to so far, the most established. A lot of folks we've been talking to have started their activism under this government, or their environmental kind of campaigns, at least under this government and under these changes we've been seeing. Wellington Water Watchers has been around for a bit. I guess, what's your thoughts on, you know, how do we win?
Perseverance is number one. You know, we win by overwhelming political pressure, and that is the only way that I believe, in these many years in, that we win. It's not necessarily that we will win by the right facts and the right, you know, like high moral ground, or whatever one wants to call it. Those are necessary, and they're really important, so that you know that you're on the side of it that you really, really feel like you can support. But we have seen time and time again that it is not facts that win a case, because there are often more than compelling facts, and there are forces that can sway because of other kinds of political pressure. And so what we really need as a community of practice around all the things that we hold dear in our hearts, around the sacred nature of water, around the right of all humans and all of life to have access to clean, healthy water. What we really need is all of us to rally together and apply that overwhelming political pressure that will push and does push. And in our experience over our 14 years of existence now, and many of us in other iterations prior to this, that we realize that's the only way to change, is just by movement development, and everybody across all the spectrums, regardless of what it is that you really feel passionate about and that you're standing up for, we can all see the intersectional lines. We can all see the places where they cross over. And if we all are willing to like support one another in those causes, we can apply that overwhelming political pressure to move the dial in the direction to support life.
Thank you so much for that, Arlene. That was not only beautifully said, but I think is a great segue into, I'd love to explore some of that connections and how water is really a connection and some issues we're seeing in Ontario right now, and how there are some common threads that relate to water. So one of the things that we've seen, and these headlines all kind of come from the past couple of weeks in the Toronto Star, is that Grassy Narrows, which is an Indigenous community that's been left behind by provincial and federal governments for generations, whose water has been poisoned through industry, the pulp and paper mill, and cleanup has not been done despite generations of proof that this is the case, generations of people being poisoned, their water unsafe to drink. Now we see that there's a surge in mining claims in their territory, and that these claims threaten their long-standing struggle for environmental justice. I sometimes listen to the Ontario legislature, and the community of Grassy Narrows has come up a couple of times. And when it's spoken about, there's this real passing the buck by the current government and by past governments as well, saying, oh, this is a federal issue. Oh, this is a jurisdictional issue. Ontario would, we can't focus on this. It's the federal government's responsibility. Excuses. Yet it's clear that our government is focused on something, because there's been time and energy put into developing a system to allow mining claims to come out. Is that kind of like parallel what you've noticed with Nestle and maybe your experience with the Environmental Registry of Ontario? Like to what extent is the government kind of creating a bureaucracy to kind of approve claims by business, or are they protecting water in some of these systems?
So that's a really great question, Alex. And one thing that I can say around this is that I think one of the things that makes our organization perhaps a little bit different or distinct in the milieu of environmental organizations doing incredible work out there is that we have a recognition and we have a political analysis in our work that understands and recognizes, and this I have to say has been a tough pill to swallow for a lot of the communities that call us in to help support their grassroots movement. But what it sits at is that there is a recognition that the colonial structures that are in place, including our current political structures that are understandably imposed by an outside colonial influence on Indigenous lands, that those colonial structures are doing exactly what they were designed to do. They are designed to facilitate resource extraction, and that is a very difficult thing for some folks who've grown up like middle to upper white class to kind of wrap our heads around. But if we understand that our structures in place are actually working in accordance with maybe the intention of what those things are, then we recognize that our work is actually in pushing to restructure the political influences that are happening at the moment, and that what we actually need is something that will embrace a governance structure that was from the land, that was from these people, from the people who are still here and who've been here forever. And that when we get caught up and entangled in what we as our organization call the bubble, so when we engage only through the mechanisms that our political structures put in place, such as the environmental registry. When we only engage that way, we are doomed to failure. We will never get the kind of successes that we want. That we need to do those because they are part of the checklist of things that you do. But we have to also recognize that analysis and exist outside of that structure and apply pressure from outside. And within that, we need to also remember to center Indigenous sovereignty, to center Indigenous governance structures who, for many millennia successfully did not destroy the places in the ways that we in our colonial structures have over the last 500 years.
Well, thank you so much for that, Arlene. And again, so for the audience knows this is not planned, but we're just on the same page. Because I think two of the things that I would just wanted to kind of check in with you on are that Indigenous communities have been kind of exercising these alternatives. So Grassy Narrows is working to have with the federal government to have, is asking the federal government to have their entire territory recognized as an Indigenous conserved and protected area, where they'll be able to kind of relationally conserve. So it's not that there's no activity going on, which is not necessarily how we maybe understand conservation, is like keep it separate. It's like a very ongoing presence. And I think questions like some of that stuff. And again, very recently and very close to home, the hereditary leadership of Six Nations has said that there's a moratorium on development on the Haldeman Tract lands, which are treaty lands that belong to Six Nations and Haudenosaunee people. And I think, again, thinking of Indigenous land defense, I think you said it perfectly, Indigenous land defense is in solidarity, we should be in solidarity with that, because that is the work to protect our water. So we're gonna chat more with you at the panel. We're so excited to kind of, now that we've kind of understood how different frames kind of can influence water issues, we're excited to maybe focus a little bit on a specific issue in Hamilton and focus on some Hamilton water issues, and then kind of come back and join these two conversations together in our panel.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Arlene. So Dawn, are you with us?
I am.
Do you want to give us just a quick update on some of the things we've noticed and what our Conservation Watch program is?
Yes, thanks for the opportunity again. One of the things that Hamilton 350 decided to do in response to the attacks on the Conservation Authority by the provincial government is establish a monitoring program to determine what's going on in the conservation authorities. What are they doing to advance in the environmental and water rights and so on? And what effect is the provincial government's attacks having on their ability to protect and advance environmental conservation? So we have we're now following 5 conservation authorities, and we're encouraging people across the province to set up their own conservation watch, attend and take notes on, and where possible get recordings of the meetings that the boards of the conservation authorities are holding. There are 36 conservation authorities across Ontario. In the Hamilton area, there are 4 that have jurisdiction within some portions of Hamilton, and their jurisdictions are not political jurisdictions, but they're watershed jurisdictions. So they start with the question of water, and they start with defining their purpose and their jurisdiction on the basis of how water flows. There, as I said, lots of challenges that have been put in front of us because of the provincial government. And some of the things that we've noticed in the last month in terms of watching the Conservation Authority meetings and seeing what is happening there. Back in December, when the provincial government passed its legislation to effectively got the authority of the conservation authorities, one of the pieces they put in place was that they could require conservation authorities to issue a permit when the conservation authorities didn't agree with that and were not supportive of that, but they're now required to do so under any ministerial zoning order. And one of the questions with the Conservation Ontario, the organization representing all 36 conservation authorities, one of the questions they asked is, okay, if we're required to do this, who's liable when things go wrong? when Amazon builds a warehouse on the Duffins Creek wetland, which is what they wanted to do, and something goes wrong, what could go wrong if you build on top of a wetland, and who's going to be liable for that? So they wrote a letter to the provincial government. It's a long-standing organization representing all 36 conservation authorities across the province. They wrote that letter in December and said, please explain what happens here. How does this work? It's now the end of April, and we were understood watching the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority meeting this month that the province has still not responded to that letter. So that's another indication of just how badly the conservation authorities are being treated by the provincial government. One of the things that also came up at that meeting, and it's significant because the attacks that took place against the conservation authorities, while they were very serious and some of them have been put in place, some of them haven't yet been put in place. And one of the major ones that we're waiting for the shoe to drop is the province deciding what exactly is the mandate of the conservation authorities in Ontario. What is their, what are they supposed to do? And conservation authorities do an awful lot of things. They own a lot of land, a lot of recreational land. They do educational programs. They certainly take care of flooding issues. They are the ones who do floodplain mapping. They're the ones who get into providing trails, which we're so fortunate to be able to utilize, particularly during the pandemic. So they have a whole lot of functions that they carry out, recreational functions. The province seems to have a different view, and their representatives such as Donna Skelly in the legislature back in December said, well, really the only function that the conservation authority should have is flooding, and everything else is not part of their core mandate. And if they want to pursue any of those kinds of things, that isn't something that anybody's required to fund. Now, conservation authorities are not funded by the province, particularly. 2% of the Hamilton Conservation Authority budget comes from the province. They're funded by municipal governments, and in many cases by multiple municipal governments, because the watersheds extend across a number of municipalities. So it looks like, we haven't seen the details yet. We're told that this is going to come out in the next few days, that anything that the province says is not part of their core mandate, they're going to have to negotiate with each of the municipalities for funding to carry on programs like providing trails, recreational programs, purchases of land, environmental effects, and so on. So that's coming out of the Conservation Watch this year. This past month, there is another item that has come up, and it came up in Hamilton. Well, let's go to the, you've got a new slide up here, so let me go to that one. We have a problem, as you know, with the Coots Paradise situation. You want to say something about that first, Alex?
Yeah, I think many of us in Hamilton or calling in from the nearby region are familiar with the 24 billion liters of sewage that linked into a provincially significant wetland. It's where all of our sewage goes because of our combined sewer outflow system. It leaves there treated generally, but when we have high stormwater events that are only going to be more common with climate change, basically our system reaches capacity, and partially treated or untreated sewage can sometimes leak out with stormwater. So this is what our system already looks like. But unfortunately, a gate was open from 2014 to 2018 that allowed for 24 billion liters of sewage leak out. And I guess this is an ongoing problem in our community. We're talking about the upcoming news with conservation authorities. We're talking about this as an ongoing infrastructure and problem in Hamilton that we just aren't talking about solutions at all. Our governments seem to be saying, well, there's just not enough money to fix everything, so we'll just have to keep sending our sewage there. But one of the things that I find particularly, I guess, kind of in summing up our earlier conversation, is just these two folks on screen here, Wendy Bush and Kirsten Willebrand, went out in 2015 on a raft to raise kind of alarm and in protest of the sanitary waste that was kind of evident along the shoreline. So folks were finding kind of hygiene products and other things that would indicate there was a potential of some pollution, some sewage leakage, and raised the alarm in 2015. That's 3 years before we ended up getting to the bottom of this. So I think, you know, we've talked a lot about how Indigenous communities are kind of ignored and delayed, you know, ignored and denied justice. But here we have kind of an Indigenous activist and Indigenous community members in Hamilton raising a concern. And if we had properly investigated this 3 years ago, a lot less would have been done, a lot less harm would have been done.
Yes, and it's likely that the sewage that these two brave women pointed a finger at was coming from another one of these sewage storage tanks that have been put in place as part of the attempt to clean up Hamilton Harbor. But the fact that we have historically dealt with our sewage in combination with stormwater by the means of dumping it directly into waterways and directly into the harbor and the lake speaks volumes about the broken relationship that was so well articulated by the first two speakers this evening, by Kelsey Leonard and Arlene Slocum. This is an ongoing issue. I mean, of course, at the end of the day, this sewage comes from all of us. But the way in which it's been managed within a municipality like Hamilton and all other municipalities in this way has been to say it's okay that when it rains heavy, well, it just goes into the creek. It just goes into the harbor. There's been, as I say, some attempt to try to start to address that. But it's a broken relationship. And there are fundamental problems with the way in which we treat our waterways, not just in terms of sewage, but in terms of other aspects as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dawn. And I guess speaking of some of the ways that maybe we're trying to restore a relationship or protect the relationship or conserve areas, I'm going to throw this over to Jim and talk about his conversation with Scott Peck.
Hello, everyone. My name's Jim Quinn, and I'm going to narrate a few slides that were set up by Mr. Scott Peck, who is the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer and Director of Watershed Planning and Engineering for the Hamilton Conservation Authority. Scott was asked to give us a presentation, and unfortunately this presentation happened during a day when the Rogers system failed quite miserably, and so we had technical difficulties with the recording. So I'm going to narrate as best I can a few of the slides and summarize what Scott said. He is here on our panel, so he can correct any confusion I may cause by my interpretation of this. You can ask him questions during the panel discussion. Here we see the lower watershed in question. And so what we see here is Battlefield Creek leading to a confluence with Stoney Creek. Here's Stoney Creek in this aerial photo. And they flow on into Lake Ontario. This picture illustrates part of the problem. This was a picture taken in Stoney Creek, and this was a high rain event where this sewer is actually right in the flowing water. Another image of Stoney Creek shows the erosion along below this parking lot. You can see the roots of these trees being exposed because of this erosion. And further evidence of bank erosion, in this case in Battlefield Creek. So there is a problem with flooding of buildings and also erosion in the lower watershed. So in 2011, there was an environmental assessment done to try to resolve these problems by altering the lower reaches of these two creeks, these two watersheds. And it turned out to be extremely expensive. That's what the outcome of this environmental assessment was, that it was prohibitively expensive. And so another idea was hatched, and that was to look at holding back water in wetlands in the upper reaches of these wetland areas, or of these watersheds. So here is the Stoney Creek watershed above the escarpment, and here's the Battlefield Creek watershed above the escarpment. The Conservation Authority worked through environmental assessments and evaluated the process and expected outcomes to address the downstream flood and erosion issue. Here you see the Battlefield Creek watershed outlined in red line, and the Stoney Creek, again, outlined in red line. So here's the Stoney Creek region. And along the escarpment, in large part, these lime green areas include the Aramosa Karst and Felkers Falls conservation areas, and the escarpment going along in this direction. The goal of this project was to create new conservation areas in the east end of Hamilton in the upper Stoney and Battlefield Creek watersheds for flood attenuation, enhanced wetland functions, reducing the impacts of high water, particularly in those lower reaches of these watersheds, but providing water in low flow periods. So it would hold back water and prevent flooding, but also allow flow to continue, to restore natural features and functions, and to provide linkages between Conservation Authority lands and enhancing recreational opportunities along the Dofasco Trail. Here in this planning legislative framework, we can see the black line here represents the boundary of the urban boundary running up this way. So to the left, the upper left, is the city of Hamilton. This reddish area reflects part of the green belt. This is the protected countryside of the green belt. And then this grayish bluish area represents the natural heritage system of the green belt. Shown along this edge above and below the escarpment are areas which are considered Niagara Escarpment Plan areas. And the direction of this work was to enhance the natural heritage system. Funding was found for a new environmental assessment that was completed in 2018 to consider the new idea of holding water back above the escarpment, creating a wetland. 4 key areas were found that were the preferred options. And the first one is this one in Battlefield Creek watershed on the east side of First Road and south of the Dofasco Trail, which is shown along here. This is the Dofasco Trail. And the idea here was that if one, in the modeling, if one were to raise the height of this road, it would hold back waters, allowing the creation of a wetland that would hold back about 225,000 cubic meters of water, which is the equivalent of about 88 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The second option in the Stoney Creek watershed near Tapleytown Road would produce a holding back of even more water just by raising the level of these roads in the modeling. A third one, also in the Stoney Creek watershed, again, by raising roads in the modeling, would amount to holding back a large amount of water, creating another wetland. The final one in the upper Stoney Creek watershed is a smaller one, but just by raising the road, wetlands could be created. At this point, I'm going to pass this back to Mr. Scott Peck, as we didn't have as many technical difficulties for the rest of this presentation. So over to Scott.
I apologize for this slide, but it's not the best. But what I really wanted to kind of highlight, and this was our aha moment with this project, is with identifying those 4 wetlands and doing the floodplain modeling and everything that our engineering staff and the consultants did to pull this together. Under existing conditions for both Battlefield and Stoney Creek, below the escarpment area, and again, that's the trigger of why we're trying to do this. It shows that 102 properties and 46 buildings are subject to flooding. They're at flood risk under existing conditions, the way the floodplain operates currently. And what the modeling tells us in putting in those 4, the preferred option with those 4 wetlands, and when they're operating, we drop down the number of properties that are at flood risk from 102 down to 52, and the number of buildings that are subject to flood risk from 46 down to 10. So that was a real aha moment for us, because it basically told us that what we thought would happen, we could do that by mimicking natural systems above the escarpment. We could address flooding and erosion issues below the escarpment. So again, as I say, this was a real aha moment, and it told us that from an engineering perspective, from the benefits to the floodplain erosion, our proposal would work. Concurrently to that, we were doing acquisition. We had secured funding from the city of Hamilton and also the Heritage Green Community Trust to acquire lands. And really with that, we acquired this parcel here. It's about 178 acres that we acquired. And this is where the Battlefield Creek wetland is. And I'll show you the design for this later in my presentation. We've acquired this parcel, and this is for the one wetland for the Stoney Creek system. And then we also acquired some other properties that are important just from a wetland restoration and preserving those wetland features. We acquired a parcel in through this area that's part of the Vine Mount Swamp, provincially significant wetland. But this is the one property where the Battlefield Creek system wetland will be located. And the wetland will be in through this area below. There's an escarpment through here, but this is where the wetland will be with Stoney Creek flowing through this area. Again, just a quick kind of some pictures to look at what it looks like. There's some karst features above where there's springs and sinkholes. This is a view of where the wetland will be in this the cultivated field where it is now. And again, this is the escarpment feature down through here. Looking at this, and this used to be a cultivated field, and since we've acquired it, we've just let it, and the amount of wetland plants that are just coming up on their own without any assistance is pretty impressive. So this just kind of gets me then just to the design that we've come up with, and this is for that Battlefield Creek wetland that we have. You can kind of see Stoney Creek coming right through here. Sorry, Battlefield Creek coming right through here. And what we've done is, if you can think back to the slide I showed you, it really showed the wetland being all up and through here. And in doing our environmental assessment work, we weren't able to go in and actually get on the land to do some of the natural heritage work we needed to do. Once we acquired it and we did some of that natural heritage work, we discovered that this was quite an important forested parcel that we didn't want to impact. So we were able to, through the work of our consultant, Watershed Edge, which are phenomenal, we were able to kind of divide it into two wetland parcels that are still holding back that same 225,000 cubic meters of water. It's just doing it in capturing the flows coming from the south off of the escarpment, and then more directly coming from the east along the main arm of Battlefield Creek. So we'll have these kind of sinuous berms in through here that you can see that will serve to hold back the water. But you can also see these lower pond-like features that are proposed within this design that, to varying degrees and to varying depths, just for different habitats, those will be permanently filled with water. The larger wetlands, they'll come and go as storm events and runoff happens, but these features in through here will have various habitats for various species. Will have different levels of water. Sometimes they will dry up, but it's the intention of those is for that to provide that variety of habitats and to hold water back for those base flow issues as well. And this is the design that we've come up with through Water's Edge for the smaller wetland on Stoney Creek. And again, it's the same idea where you have a natural looking berm to hold the overall water back, and then also have these islands of habitat. The main wetland, it will fill up and then slowly drain away, but these ones will have water in them just depending on the type of season that we're having. So the next steps with this project, it's been quite a great project to be involved with, a lot of excitement in the community. We're looking to acquire additional lands. We have the lands we need for our first two wetlands. We're working on continued land acquisition for the third and fourth wetland. We're looking to finalize the design for that first wetland, and our priority really is that BC1 wetland, as we refer to it. This wetland complex here is our main priority, and it's our hope that we'll go to construction of that first wetland in probably winter to spring of 2022, so people can get out and see what it's like in real life. So Jim, with that, that's my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are, or however you'd like to proceed.
So thanks very much for that presentation, Scott. I do have a few questions. Now, some of the areas you described are not necessarily part of your project, but you said you acquired some wetlands that are existing wetlands, and I'm just wondering if you have intentions to monitor the new wetlands and sort of to contrast them with nearby existing wetlands, just to get some idea of how quickly they're developing, and perhaps even to track the development of ecosystem services in those newly established wetlands.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Jim. Actually, I can send you a link of this, but we've actually, through the Greenbelt Foundation, did an economic analysis of this project as to whether it made financial sense to do the project, because the construction cost to put the wetlands in place it's not cheap. It's kind of reinforced in my head is that it's better to keep wetlands in place than trying to recreate them. But this is a good opportunity to recreate them, certainly. So we do have that linkage that shows that it is financially, it makes sense to do it from that economic perspective. But on the monitoring question, we've certainly highlighted within the design work and post-construction work for our staff, there's going to be a real need to do ongoing monitoring to, keep in check invasive species coming into some of these areas, because in disturbing some of these areas, that's sometimes prime habitat for them to come in. So we're going to be doing those that monitoring work to make sure that the wetlands are functioning as designed, and that over time they become more fully functioning wetlands, because it will take time for that to happen. As far as comparing that monitoring work to adjacent wetlands and to see how they compare, we really haven't considered that at all. But certainly something I could talk to my staff about to see how we could take a look at how the wetlands, what we're doing with them, and how that compares to just some of the other properties that we've acquired that have wetlands on them, and how they're kind of regenerating and comparing the two.
It just seems to me that in this day and age where, people are talking about swapping land and that sort of thing, it would be really interesting to have some handle on how much time it really takes, I would think that an existing wetland is worth a lot as it is an existing functioning wetland. And to replace that and trade it off with some other land it might be very helpful to have an idea of how much you're losing by doing that kind of a swap.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that the bottom line is that we've always seen that in creating the wetland, it's amazing how quickly nature adapts to that. And over time, it will become more fully functional. But there's certainly a time lag there from when you create the wetland to when it becomes, a fully functional wetland.
Could you summarize the main benefits of building or enhancing wetlands, just briefly?
Well, I think really the two main benefits of protecting wetlands and enhancing wetlands is really they are nature's filter. They are nature's storm water control, and they're also nature's, they're from a natural habitat perspective. And again, it depends on what type of wetland that you're talking about, whether it's a swamp or a marsh or a bog or a fen. They all have different habitats and different types of, I'll say, critters that keep there. But to me, keeping wetlands and enhancing wetlands it provides those storage from runoff events, be it storm events or winter runoff. It's water quality benefits. There's a lot of times wetlands can be associated with groundwater recharge areas that address that sort of interaction. There's always the natural heritage benefits, and I think from my perspective, it's the human perspective too, of being able to see just different types of habitat.
is there a difference in terms of the value of an enhanced wetland versus a new wetland that has been built from scratch? And I'm thinking of differences in things like biodiversity. That might be the most obvious one. Supporting rare species, successional stages, even flood mitigation and carbon sequestration. I don't know to what extent those would be different.
The authority's policy direction as it relates to wetlands is to try to keep them in place and to maintain them and to enhance them where possible. And I think we do a pretty good job of that. This project, the Salt Fleet project, is just that enhancement to try to put wetlands back in place, that may or may have not been there in that exact location. But, we know there's been significant wetland loss across Canada and specifically across Southern Ontario. So I think the take-home message from my perspective, it's always better to keep a wetland and try to make that wetland better. But when you have an opportunity like we have with the Salt Fleet project to build new wetlands and kind of enhance those wetland features that are kind of present already, that's a good substitute, I would suggest.
Are there suitable Conservation Authority owned lands in upper Spencer Creek area that could be enhanced? And might there be some, as you put it, aha moments or opportunities there?
I think that's a question I don't know if I can answer really. With Valens and Fletcher Creek and the associated Fletcher Creek swamp, the Beverly swamp, and the Hazeland area, there's a fair amount of wetlands there in place now. So I think just because of the number of them in that watershed, and they're provincially significant wetlands, I don't think we've turned our attention to that as to a need for that sort of thing. But in the future, perhaps, but it's just something we haven't really considered at this point in time.
And my last question is a little bit related to that. Would expanding wetlands in upper Spencer Creek lands benefit flooding risks, possibly carbon capture and biodiversity, flooding risks in particular in Dundas, I'm thinking?
I'm a planner by background. I'm not an engineer, but I would suspect that just given the scale of the Spencer system, for you to use wetlands within that to augment flood control so it protects Dundas, I would think you'd have to have some fairly large and wetlands put in place that would have that added benefit to it. But again, we haven't really done any analysis of that as to what benefits there would be. I think the short answer is that I think there's the potential for that. In a nutshell, the quick answer is that yes, probably they would have a benefit. It's just to what scale it would have.
Are you able to just give a quick update? It sounded like the conversation between Scott and Jim there was talking a little bit about replacing wetlands, or just like the differences between an established wetland and a new wetland. Based on kind of our conservation watch, like why is this particularly a relevant conversation right now?
Well, there is a proposal before the Hamilton Conservation Authority initiated by some developers last fall to relocate a wetland so they can build a warehouse. Sounds a lot like the Duffins Creek situation. The property is 140 Garner Road, and it's near Fiddler's Green. And it's actually was featured in the newspaper in a somewhat different way earlier this week. You may have seen the piece about the $49 million home that you can buy at 140 Garner Road. Used to be 78 million, now it's down to 49 million because half the property has been set aside for another purpose, and the newspaper doesn't talk about what that is, but we understand that it is to try to get the Conservation Authority to agree to relocate a wetland and allow a warehouse to be built there. So that has generated a lot of disagreement on the Conservation Authority Board, which was visible at the April meeting of the Conservation Authority Board. And as a result of this discussion and where this is going, there is a paper that has been prepared to look at whether or not the Conservation Authority should provide the possibility of relocating wetlands, and if they do, what those relocations would look like. And this has been further complicated by the fact that the provincial government has taken up doing ministerial zoning orders. And as a result of the ministerial zoning orders, they can now force conservation authorities to allow development in wetlands. So the issue of compensation for those wetlands is a more live issue than it was before the change in legislation. And this paper that has been prepared by is coming out public input. We'll have more detail.
Sorry, Dawn, you're cutting. You're just cutting out a bit there, but it sounded like you were saying that this conversation is, you know, still happening and is kind of, there's going to be some public consultation coming up, and this is a situation to maybe ask some questions about tonight, but also keep our eyes on in the future. Someone's drawn on the screen, which I didn't know was possible during Zoom. So I'd ask if you did that intentionally, you undo it, but I'm assuming it was an accident. And so I'm going to stop screen sharing, because just as we know, we're going to send out some information as we always do. Some highlights that just before we kind of jump into our panel is that the Green Venture right now has some grant funding available. If you're hearing this and you're saying you want to build your relationship with your water or with water on your property, or you want to kind of help with stormwater outflow to kind of reduce the burden on our sewer infrastructure, there's some money available right now to introduce green infrastructure on your property. So check out Green Venture's website, and we'll also send that out in an email. The Hamilton Sprawl survey that we talked about in detail at our last webinar about where we should have our urban boundary is coming to you soon, and we'd really recommend folks fill that out, advocating for a no urban boundary expansion. And lastly, we'd, as always, encourage folks to get engaged with Hamilton 350. And there's tons of ways to do that, but I think the easiest one, and Steph's probably put this in the chat, but yeah, I believe is it volunteer at Hamilton 350? Steph, is that the email?
Hamilton 350 volunteers@gmail.com. I will put it in the chat though, thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Steph. And yeah, I'm gonna stop my screen sharing just because of the drawing, but I do have one question, I guess, for you, Arlene, and you, Scott, and then I think we're going to throw it open to kind of everyone to ask some questions. But I guess, and I guess Scott, I'll ask you first if that's okay. But I guess with climate change on the mind and kind of that being the lens that 350 is kind of coming at this from, it seems like there's lots of potential when we look at our wetlands, both in terms of protecting water to prevent future emissions, like the Amazon warehouse in Duffins Creek, like that's going to lock in emissions. Would that be protecting water from resource extraction or sprawl? There's this huge preventative effect when it comes to the climate crisis, but there's also nature-based solutions can help us with reduction in carbon emissions. And I think Jim was asking some questions about that. So I guess how should the climate crisis change how we approach water conservation and water protection?
Well, I guess just first, if I can, I just want to, if there's any questions about the Salt Fleet project, by all means, my email address is on there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about that. I guess just the second part too would be the Salt Fleet project is very much different than the discussion paper, and just to highlight. As it relates to the discussion paper, as it relates to the natural offsetting and the proposal for 140 Garner Road. the board has given us direction to come up with policy as it relates to that natural offsetting. And as staff, we will do that. And that will be being sent out publicly in the beginning of May for commenting. And again, if there's any comments on that, we'd love to hear from you. And the permit application for 140 Garner Road is, again, a separate issue that the board will consider and make their decision regarding that based on our existing policies. So I wasn't expecting really to speak to those or to have them addressed tonight, but that's just to kind of clarify those points. But as it relates to wetlands and conservation and climate change, it's an incredibly difficult question to answer, I think. And the easiest answer really is the more wetlands that we can preserve, and even where we can enhance them through land acquisition and restoration of areas, I think the better. That we've always specified that at the Conservation Authority from a climate change perspective is that really nature from the authority's perspective is really our best tool against climate change I'll say that adaptation to the mitigation and the adaptation to that. But if we can keep our wetlands so that they are holding that water, they're acting as those sponges on the landscape to slowly release water back into stream systems through that filtering. And again, it depends on what kind of a wetland you're talking about, but its ability to hold carbon in place. I think largely, whether it's wetlands, forested tracts, my ecology staff even tell me that prairie plants do an excellent job of that carbon sequestration too. So certainly wetlands are incredibly important, and the Hamilton CAs and so I think yes, keeping them and enhancing them wherever we can is that is a key tool to those climate change mitigation principles that we're trying to work with.
Thank you so much for the clarification and also for that answer. Arlene, when you kind of hear about, or when you're thinking about the climate crisis, how do you think that should change our understanding or approach to water protection and watershed conservation?
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and agree that it's like incredibly complex, right? So there's no like silver bullet, no clear single straight answer or approach. But one thing that I often sit with, and in both, whether we're talking about the climate crisis or water protection or any other kind of reflection on protection or conservation that we are facing at this day and age, is like, to what degree are we incorporating some kind of co-governance structure, and what degree are we looking to look to traditional governance structures that have existed on these lands in perpetuity, and how is it that we're framing these crises that we face? Like can we take a step in recognizing that these crises that we faced are created by the problems that this colonial mindset has developed and imposed on the land? And my worry and concern is that if we continue to think that our ways of coming out of those crises are informed by the same model that created them, that we might be just spinning in circles, or worse, creating further harm and further damage. And so I think this is like actually a critical juncture, as we are completely in crisis for all the things that we're in crisis for at the moment, the pandemic revealing the many aspects of the crises that we're facing, to see all of the ways that these things are not isolated events, that they are completely overlapping, and they are completely intersectional, and they are not distinct from any social justice issues that we might be looking at too, and that we cannot solve them from the mindset of a colonial infrastructure. And that we have, thankfully, that we have as guests on these lands, we have a huge body of work and of representation of models that could and do work on these lands here, and that could help us globally out of these crises that we face. So I appreciate and respect, and like in terms of wetlands are the lifeblood. They are absolutely essential, and I completely respect and honor every attempt to first of all not destroy them in their original impact, and to do what we can to support them, and where possible maybe even recreate them. But in the recreating of them, to what degree are we including Indigenous governance models, and what voice does that have there, so that we're not just continually perpetuating problems? And I'm sure there are many minds who've given that lots of thought, and I don't mean to be rude or presumptuous in that, but I think that the crises all around that we're facing point to the problems of colonialism, and the pathway out of that is decolonization and restructuring the ways that we're thinking and doing and acting, as not a dominance over, but an integration with.
Thank you so much for that, Arlene. And yeah, I think that's we want to thank everyone for kind of coming tonight. We're going to switch it to you ask some questions now. But I did just want to say tonight we presented kind of some perspectives on water, or some ways we could think about our relationship with water. They range from the sacred to how we kind of have come in Hamilton sometimes to think of our waterways as part of our sewer infrastructure. So there's tons of there are examples of relationships out there, and I think we also have to kind of start deciding what the type of relationship we want is, and start acting towards that. So yeah, that's it for us, and we'd love to hear from you. Steph, can you take it away?
Hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for such an engaging conversation in the chat during this webinar. It's been great. We have had some questions, so I'm going to direct them to the panel now, or rather call on our participants to direct them. I just want to go over some guidelines really quickly before we get into that, especially since we're getting so close to the 8:30 cutoff. So we are limiting this Q&A portion of the webinar to questions asked by participants in the chat during the event, and they've already been talked to about it. So we're going to have a question from Ann Washington, Dan Nowak, and Nancy Hurst. In respect to the time, again, for those who have to leave 8:30 or another certain time, we ask that you keep any questions or comments yourself during the Q&A. But afterwards, we will be holding a space for open discussion in case you do have any other questions that weren't answered during this webinar, but you can ask them at that time. So first of all, we're going to move to Anne, but actually she has already had to leave, so I'm going to ask the question on her behalf. Her question was, what, if any, government regulations are there regarding the removal of water in Canada? What does it cost a company to take water? Are there limits on how much they can take? I imagine, Arlene, you're probably the best person to answer, so you go ahead.
I can take a stab at that, and it's not an exactly easy answer, because jurisdictionally water is governed at many different levels. So there's federal regulations around bulk water exports, but in terms of water permits, those are governed provincially, and so there is a process to request a permit to take water. If you are a taker who is requiring more than 50,000 liters a day, you are required to apply for a permit to take water, and there is a regulatory process for that. There is a fee that anyone applying or who receives a permit has to pay. The fee, though, this is something that I think really needs some clarity, because it can look as though the fee is paying for the water. And I think as a society here, we have all invested in through tax dollars and through infrastructure across our societies, that water is one of those things that we believe should be available for everyone. So we pay dollars to taxes to create the infrastructure that delivers water to the places that we need, to our homes, to businesses, to schools, etc. The process for the permit to take water, the fees that are associated in that are fees for the regulation and the administration of the permit for fees, and not actually for the water itself. So although it's assigned by the amount of water you use, which is the same as your home bill on water, it is not actually like paying for the water, it's paying for the infrastructure of the water. And that's an important distinction, because for water takers who are using it for the purposes of profit, one of the angles that people have said is just like charged through the nose for those corporations to have to pay for the money. And that's a like a tactic and a strategy that is worth a conversation, but it also then would undermine, I think, our societal belief that water is not fundamentally for sale and nobody actually owns it. So that which I strongly believe in and strongly support. So the fees that a corporation like Nestle, say, for example, that's extracting water for the purpose of bottling, they're paying for the administration of the process to allow for permitting of water. And that fee dramatically increased recently for water bottlers, which we were happy to see, because that actual process takes a lot more time on behalf of the ministry, because so many people are fundamentally opposed to that as a use of water, that the ministry has to spend an awful lot of time managing that. And it makes sense that that fee should be higher for that industry. And in fact, that's one of our other arguments, that what we would really like to see is a fulsome conversation around prioritization of water when it comes to those water permits, and what we all as a collective might believe that water should be used for, and prioritize those in order of use, so that we can see the ones that we collectively don't think or find value in, and when crisis is upon us, we have the easy cutoff valves on, like, this one we are already lowered in prioritization. I believe the repricing and the refinancing on the fees for permitting is a step in that direction, which is a good step, but we have a lot farther to go.
That's very interesting, Arlene, and thank you. My understanding is Chile does have a system like that in place, with the turning off and on different sources of water when and if it is needed to be controlled in that way. So it'd be interesting to see that happen in Canada. My next question is coming from Stan, and I'll leave it to you to answer it, Stan, but I think it is touching on a bit of what you just said too, Arlene, so this should be interesting. Go ahead, Stan.
Okay, hi everybody. Arlene, first of all, just a question. When are you going to run for Prime Minister? Just saying. Somebody mentioned in the chat about our First Nations people had a sensitivity, such an appreciation of our water. Somebody mentioned the term interconnectedness. Okay, I'm just going to read what I wrote here. How can we, as an enlightened society, and I put that in quotes, pass along that interconnectedness of all things successfully and efficiently to those who are against or indifferent to such principles? High order, I know perhaps there's no answer, but I'd like to hear your take on it, and how we can really, I mean, it makes sense to me, but how can we convey that sense to the so-called non-believers?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question and an important one. And the thing that I would give in response to that is simply reiterating things that have been told to me and to us in our organization by Indigenous folks with whom we are, in relationship with, endeavoring to become allies, let alone one day accomplices. So what I have heard with, in no uncertain terms, are two very, very clear directives that are easy to do because they're so simple in their comprehension, is that as an individual, I have a responsibility to be in relationship with the water that gives me life. So I have a responsibility. I have a responsibility to, to go to the source of the water that, is the thing that allows me to live, and be in relationship with it, like be grateful for it, and be in that relationship when I turn the tap on. And if I struggle to do that through the tap, to actually go out, I'm blessed to live right here, not far from the beautiful Aramosa River, and I can go to it daily and be in relationship that way. So the first directive was to be in relationship, to develop and like actually feel the relationship with water. Because then when we do that, the understanding there was that there is another kind of wisdom that surfaces that can allow us to speak in a more compelling way, that can allow us to invite others into that relationship. And the second, which was also really clear and pretty easy to follow, is to, at every step of the way, center Indigenous sovereignty. So I have this maybe arrogant like attempt at calling myself a water advocate here. I'm a guest on these lands, and I endeavor to be a good ancestor here on these lands. I'm endeavoring to do that work, and my obligation, my responsibility in it is to develop my personal relationship with water and do it daily. And second, to develop my relationships with the indigenous peoples of these lands, and to center the values and the governance structures that exist here that come from the land. And I think the two of those work in concert, because if I'm developing my relationship with the water, it, as I say, it invites in a certain type of openness to a wisdom that exists in a different way here. So it in essence is like working to decolonize my like colonized mind. And so those are the two simple things, and there's something like we all can do as individuals, and I believe they have immense power.
It's a change yourself, change the world kind of mentality, developing almost like a spiritual relationship with water.
Yeah.
I mean, we're 80% of it is in our beings, I guess. Thank you so much, Arlene. I'm so glad this is being recorded. I can't wait to see this again.
Oh, that's so lovely, Scott. Thanks so much. And yes, thank you very much, Arlene, for that answer. I think it leads nicely into what Nancy is going to ask next about relationships with water, about appreciating where water and wetlands come from. So Nancy, feel free to round off this Q&A. That'd be great.
Hi. Hello. Hi, everybody. This is just again, a question. Maybe this is not the time or place, but I'm very concerned about the wetlands that we're talking about offsetting. And I just wondered, I know that the Hamilton Conservation Authority Board is bringing the question to the forefront, and perhaps staff is not exactly all on board with that. But I did hear somebody say something about how at the last meeting that I was listening to, it's a good idea to maybe have a policy in place in the event that an MZO is brought up. And I just wondered if maybe Mr. Peck, you could tell me, is it a good idea in your opinion to have a policy in place just in case an MZO comes along, or is it a slippery slope maybe? Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. I'll answer that as best I can. That really the board has directed staff to develop a policy and to go out and consult and to bring back for them for their consideration. There's that policy framework, and then there's the MZO situation. And with the policy framework that the board has asked us to go out and develop and bring back to them, that's really where through a planning or permit application, I want to stress that it's not for HCA lands. It's not that we're looking to do anything to anything on our lands. It's for a planning or a development permit through our regulation. That's policy is really there for those situations where the board wants to make that decision based on what the circumstances are to either allow for the offsetting or not allow the offsetting to take place. And that policy that we're looking at developing would give them guidance in that regard. When it comes to the MZOs, really though, is that the decision has already been made. So there's really no need to have a policy in place, because the province, through the approval of the MZO, has said this will happen in this location, whatever it is. And it really what we'd be looking at from that perspective, and what would fall out of a policy if the board so chooses to approve one, is to actually then have implementation guidelines in place, so that, you know, if an MZO came in, we would have those implementation guidelines that says, okay, if it's a forest, it's a wetland, or whatever the natural feature is, these are the guidelines that we would want to have in place to guide us to determine what the replacement would be. You know, that sort of, if one tree is cut, do we require 3 trees to be planted in its place, sort of thing. If you lose an acre of wetland, are we looking for an acre and a half of wetland to be put back in place? And Credit Valley Conservation and the Toronto Region Conservation have implementation policies in place now, and they're quite complex again. So really, the answer to your question is that the policy development, again, if the board so chooses to develop one, to approve one, really would have no impact on the MZO, because again, the MZO, the decision has been made already to allow the development to go. And an MZO is a ministerial zoning order. Under the Planning Act, the minister has the ability to basically override municipal land use planning requirements and basically put in a zoning order that allows something to take place from a land use planning perspective.
That's great, Scott. Thank you so much. And someone literally just asked in the chat, I don't know if you saw it, what is an MZO? So that was such perfect timing. I assume you did. But you're all over it. All right, that's great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for those questions for the panel. And thank you to the panelists for answering them so well. I'm going to turn it over to Jim for a minute before we turn it back to Alex to end things out here. And then we'll move into the open discussion for those of you who are able to stay afterwards. So Jim, to you.
Yes, thanks. Thanks very much, everyone, for attending. And I just wanted to, because the actual video got cut off prematurely, I wanted to thank Scott so much for coming on and doing that presentation, and apologize for any misleading words I may have had in my summary of the first several slides. I hope that came across reasonably consistently with what you were after, Scott. And I'm glad that you were recorded well enough to take over for the more complex and critical parts of the presentation. So thanks very much again for everyone coming out, and thanks again for Scott and for Arlene to appear in this webinar. And I'll pass it over to Alex.
Sure. Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add beyond another thank you, and to say I think this is kind of the conclusion of our program tonight. So we're going to keep the lines open if people want to keep chatting, but I know some of our guests, some of you probably have to jump off. So that's, if you were looking for permission, you have it. There you go. And then if you would like to stay on and keep chatting, a few of us will stay as well. But yeah, again, a thank you to everyone for coming. If you registered through the Zoom link, we have your email, we'll send out some info. And something to think about really is, you know, whether it be through a conservation mindset or through a different mindset, like how are we going to be engaging with our water and the water close to us in the coming days and weeks, is I think a question we can hopefully all reflect on.